Welcome to Sweetspot Safari. I'm Ben, and this is John. So today's conversation explores the differences between shallow and deep. So what do I mean by shallow and deep? Well, you might be familiar with this pattern in the context of a physical space, say a swimming pool, which has a shallow and deep end. You might think of an iceberg, where you'll be familiar with what's on the surface is just a small representation of what's below the surface at a deeper level. Or you might recognize it perhaps as a character sense. If I only talked about money or the things I could buy with it, you might call me shallow. But on the other hand, if I lived my life through pursuing intrinsic values, you might refer to me as having some sort of depth of character. But today we're going to talk about this pattern in the context of engagement and communication, and perhaps how our digital environment is shaping our interactions with one another. So John, why are we talking about this, and why is it perhaps a challenge?
I think, first of all, thanks, Ben, for the introduction. It's, again, like everything else, it's a heavily nuanced topic, where there's lots of different perspectives. And I like your physical space analogy. And as you say, today we're going to go into the more engagement, esoteric space. But I think things that are really important is it can affect our daily lives, how we work. You can imagine everything we do, we do work, we analyze things, we produce things, whether that be content or physical things. And we have a choice. We have a choice to either go deep, which means go further and further and further and look into the analysis because it's really pertinent that we do that. Or we can take a shallow approach where we just, for want of better word, skim the surface. Both of which, by the way, have their place. The trick, like everything else, is that we have to know when and where is the best time to go and use it. And having a level of self-awareness on what the impacts of these are particularly will make a difference to our performance, both in our personal lives and in our professional lives. So, I think one of the things we have to be really cognizant of is that it seems obvious that deep would be better potentially, right? Because, we get more information and everything else. That's not always the case. There is a time, and sometimes where actually skimming the surface gives a better view, and it means we can be more agile. So I don't think the two, one doesn't outweigh the other, and in the same way, they're not always mutually exclusive, if that makes sense, Ben. So hopefully that provides a bit of extra context in terms of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and I think something which you keep coming back to is that context does matter, doesn't it? And I think that's a crucial point. And if we're just constantly going deep into a particular subject, all of the time, it's there's always trade-offs involved. And actually, sometimes sometimes we just need to know small bits of information or exchange small bits of communication to one another. And it makes me think about our digital context and perhaps how that has changed our communication. And probably since the rise of the iPhone in 2007, the rise of the various social media platforms, have you noticed how you engage with people and clients changing over the last 10, 15 years? Are there any particular patterns which you kind of sense that you tune into?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think it goes through cycles. So actually, I'm showing my age now. Before the iPhone, I wasn't quite touchscreen, but I was in the BlackBerry cycle, right? And then at the time when everybody, people remember BlackBerries, was BBMing, and it was like the Palm Pilot beforehand. It was like the corporate tool, and people became obsessed with it because it was like a new toy, it was a new gimmick. And I think this, and we've talked about it before, and other people have talked about it. This whole idea of 24-hour connection, can be a good thing to a certain extent in small bursts, but also it can be an extremely bad thing. And I've noticed, particularly more recently, although it's tailing off because I think people are kicking back, I do a lot of work in the corporate space, is that people do get stressed by this 24-hour connection. The idea that you can have 3 or 4 email accounts on one device away from your PC gives you very little downtime. Even now, when you fly medium haul or long haul, you've got Wi-Fi on the plane, so you can't even shut that down as well now. So that, I think, creates a bit of extra stress. But I think people are beginning to manage that. And the thing about information is, and this applies to both going shallow and deep, it's just the volume of information. Our brain has limited capacity at the end of the day. It's not finite. And therefore, if we fill it with stuff, something else has to, get displaced. I remember hearing a great analogy, the brain is like a bucket, you fill it for water and you keep filling it with water and the water spills over, and I think that's something that, we have to be very cognizant of. And I think I think, again, knowing the difference between shallow and deep in terms of engagement and where it's most appropriate will help us, because we'll be able to compartmentalize things and segment things, which will actually give us some more breathing space. I remember an interview once with Stephen Fry, the actor and the intellectual, and they said, because he ran a program called QI, and he amazed people with his knowledge. His general knowledge was just amazing. And he said once, when he was asked about how did he get so good at remembering things and coping with knowledge, and he said, well, actually, it's just a massive library. I've compartmentalized my brain into places where I can actually find things very, very quickly and very rapidly. It's not that I'm necessarily any brighter than anybody else. I mean, you could argue he's being humble, but it is amazing how people do that. So I think, to round that off and then pass back to you, I think the management of information and knowledge, and I know the digital place is a place where you work, is so important these days, because the digital space isn't going to go away. I think it's how we manage it. If that makes sense, Ben.
Yeah, it does. And I think, just to pick up on the point about the metaphor as the brain as a bucket, is quite an interesting one, because, as I mentioned here before, and pretty well, that living with ADHD, attention deficit, there's something about the information world where we have access to infinite amount of information. And I can't remember the exact quote, but when information is abundant, something else is more scarce, and that's our attention. So our attention and the volume of information work inversely, in an inverse pattern. So the more information there is, the worse our attention becomes, because that is finite. And I think that connects well with your bucket analogy. And so I think for me, what I've noticed is that, living with ADHD, the digital world has delivered great things, but very specifically about attention, is that it seems to harm our ability to have sustained periods of attention on a single task. And so that's what I've particularly found, that the way that we engineer our tools, whether it's actually our physical devices or our virtual platforms, almost in some, almost as part of the design, that we've actually engineered them to distract us, whether it's kind of pop-up advertising, whether it's notification beeps, hyper-stimulating visuals, and I think that's definitely a problem for me. And I'm not the only person to be suffering with attention and distraction issues. So it's not all doom and gloom, because I think that for me, the rise of podcasts has been great, because actually, listening to an audio podcast for a couple of hours, I'm able to pay, good attention to that. So I think the way that the kind of visual part of our digital landscape is more troubling. But it does make me think about, a bigger picture, our kind of wider society. It seems to me that, whether it's GDP, whether it's consumerism, whether it's kind of the like and share culture, which you talk about, it seems to be that our society is built on quite a lot of superficial activity. We're busy doing lots of shallow activity. And it makes me wonder actually how much of it is kind of deep and meaningful. Any views on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd like to come back onto your point about the shallowness of processing data, in terms of having to react and actually deal with large volumes of data. I see a lot of that in the corporate consulting space. I think people now is this, as you say, this hyper stimulation has triggered people to spend more time processing the data rather than understanding the true meaning of what's going on. And I've had recent experience of that on a recent engagement, where the sheer volume of what has been agreed is just too great, in my view, right, for what needs to be done to deliver the right outcome. Okay, I'm not in direct control of that, But I know there's myself and a number of other people who are more focused on depth, for instance, because of outcome, are beginning to challenge. Because what happens is when we review stuff, everything just gets skimmed over, right, to a point, because there is no time available, because that bucket, for want of a better word, is overflown. So I think your point is really well made, and I think we need to be very, very aware of that. And I think it's incumbent on people who can see it is to challenge it in the right way. Now, I don't mean, by the way, that all depth is good, and I think we need to put this into context, and all shallow is bad. And there are times when you do need to be agile. I was thinking of the scenarios, obvious one is in the military. Sometimes you have to respond very quickly. You have limited information and you have to move on. That's the obvious one. I know, being a lean practitioner, we focus very much on the 80-20 rule and the 60-40 rule to avoid what we call, perfectionism or postponed procrastination. But there are other times where, we do need to go very, very deep, because the criticality, the expression, everybody said the expression, the devil is in the detail. And I think that's really important. And I go back to my point is that we need to know when and where to do that. And I think that's a real skill. We've talked about other skills on Sweetspot Safari, about the difference between being in the helicopter and being in the weeds, for instance, having the difference between having strategic oversight and actually looking into the depth of all the detail, which is a slight nuance on that point. But the thing is, I think we just need to be aware. And what I'm worried about, and I'd be interested to say what other people think about it, and your views, Ben, is that with this huge volume of information, is our ability to be self-aware and understand is limited, because we're so busy processing, we're not thinking as much. Does that make sense, Ben?
Yeah, it does. And it reminds me of we're almost being conditioned to simulate thinking, that we mindlessly go on to platforms, and almost like the platform then takes over the operations of our minds, that we scroll, we just engage at a superficial level with, and I'm particularly thinking social media, that there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of intention with a lot of activity which goes on the platform, I think, to your point. So actually, I think for me, it's there's an author called Cal Newport, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Deep Work, and I think just some people are having to make the choice that, and I include myself in this, that I'm deliberately going to spend less time on these platforms because they make me work at a shallow, superficial level, and they change how I think, they change how I behave, and not in a productive way, not in a good way. And so I think that what Cal Newport is talking about is that deep work is difficult, and human nature is to take the path of least resistance. It's really easy for us to build shallow, superficial habits, because actually that's a survival imperative. We don't do the more difficult deep work, deep habits, good habits very easily, and it is difficult. And so I just find that actually the important thing for me is to say no. And rather than processing what you're pointing out, is that you're processing more and more stuff. Actually, I'm processing less and less stuff. So I'm actively saying no to going on to these platforms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think you're not alone. I've looked at now some of the platforms myself, and if I look at superficiality before I move on to my next point, I think that LinkedIn used to be a place for thought leadership, and very much so. And there's still some of it around, where people are, doing some really clever stuff. People are challenging, people are putting thoughts out there, and they're counter-challenging in a very constructive way. But there's a lot of self-promotion, for instance, going on now on that sort of platform. It's very much become salesy, which is part of the algorithms and everything else, which again, inevitably, I think will turn some people off. But I'd like to pick on a couple of points and take it on a slightly different direction, if that's okay, Ben. I think, we're going back to this processing thing. We've Daniel Kahneman's book, thinking fast and slow. You know, he talks about the type 1 brain, the type 2 brain, where the type 1 is the developed intuitive brain, you know, which is the one which enables you to deal with things in a hurry, because it's, you know, it's basically earned collateral based on experience. You know, that has its place. Sometimes people call it fight, flight, or fright to simplify it in certain situations, but it can also lead to problems as well. The type 2 brain, of course, is the cognitive space where people do deeper thinking and deeper processing and stuff, and making more sense and meaning out of things. And getting those two out of sync, which is what Daniel talks about, can cause problems, leading to catastrophic decision making. You know, there's another author which I like greatly, Margaret Heffernan, and she's written a book called Willful Blindness about cognitive dissonance, about how people actually switch off as well emotionally to actual real life situations and the data that they see in front of them, because they don't want to believe stuff. So I think there's a bit of a link there as well about how we process stuff in the brain and how we really make sense of what goes on. And I'd like to make a little analogy about quality and volume, if that's okay. I mean, it's something that I talk about quite a lot when I'm doing some either lecturing or facilitation, particularly when people are actually trying to make sense of getting work done. There's a triangle, it's in my book, and it's called the cost, quality, speed triangle. And it's quite interesting because everybody thinks that you can actually have all three, and in reality you can't. You can only have two out of the three. You want to play this game yourselves, it's quite good fun. I mean, if you can have something that's very cheap, but if you want it to be fast, right, it's going to be low quality. So you can't have all three, right? If you want something that's going to be very, very high quality, you can have it high quality, but it's going to cost you a lot, and it's probably going to be slow as well. So what I'm saying is there's a payoff. And I think, again, this is about, I want to bring back to this point about self-awareness. People need to be aware of what they can do and what they can't do. And, you know, the world's littered with situations where people have overestimated their own, I wouldn't say competence because that's hard, but their own abilities, for want of a better word, to get things done. And I think, you know, more aware you are of understanding what the limitations are because of the system limitations, it's not just you personally, you know. And I think that's partly what Stephen Fry was alluding to. I think the better place will be, and we'll, you know, there are times to be deep, right? And it makes a lot of sense. And there are times to be shallow, but getting things in the right ratio and knowing what that is very powerful. And I think because we live in a fast-paced world, it's becoming more difficult, to your point, Ben, for people to take a break and make sense of it all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I really like the cost, quality, and speed framework, because actually we used that for our house build. So when we were going out to tender for different builders, obviously we had a budget. We had an idea about when we wanted to start and how long it would take to build, and obviously quality was a factor too. And so there was those three factors which really shaped who we ended up going with. And obviously those three rank differently in terms of importance and outcome depending on the project. So yeah, I really like that. That's a really useful thing which I've used as well. And I think the point about Kahneman and Margaret Heffernan. So Kahneman is a really interesting one. It's not, the point is, it's not one or the other is better. Actually, both are very important for decision making. Both are very important for humans and our survival from, you know, being on the savannah to the world we live in now. But it's our ability to switch between these different thinking styles depending on the context, which is really important. And then I think the point about willful blindness and cognitive dissonance, actually these are just two aspects of our mental faculties, where we're riddled with biases and blind spots. And biases are like heuristics or shortcuts, and they're basically meant to be kind of really efficient at making decisions. But of course, these decisions are not always good ones in all contexts. So actually, just being aware of these shortcuts, which might lead to maybe kind of shallow outcomes, I think is really important. And we've all got these, and they show up at different times. They show up, perhaps, if you think about it, on social media environments. So without the social media environments, you don't get the kind of deeper context of the subject matter of the person. And so I think the nature of the way that we design our digital tools does again push us towards more shallow engagement and more preying on our biases, let's say. But I do think that just bringing in one of my own analogies here, I do think that the way that we consume information, and it's an abundance of information, a bit like our abundance of food, is a bit like a fast food diet, that actually we just want more and more and more of it without actually asking what for, and how is it helping? Why do we need this? So yeah, that's just one thought, one analogy there.
No, that's good. And I'd like to follow on that thread, because I know you talked about podcasts, which you listen to, and I'm listening more and more to podcasts now. Again, we're trying to find these sweet spots, where the balance point is, as we said before, whether it be type 1, type 2, shallow versus deep, superficiality, versus, real understanding of a topic. And it makes me think of another author, somebody who I like a lot, is Nassim Taleb, who's written a whole load of books as a Lebanese mathematician and professor of risk. His first book, critically acclaimed, was Black Swan, but he's written a whole series of books called In Concerto, Fooled by Randomness, Skin in the Game, very, very powerful books. And the one I'm reading at the moment is Anti-Fragile, all of which take some thinking in order to understand them, and you read them off the page. But I remember watching the YouTube video from him. It was quite funny, and he deliberately said, if I just give you one book and I put everything in one book, you'll just buy one book. If I spread the theories, connect everything across a series of 4 or 5 books and in concerto, you're going to have to buy more books. So he was having a joke about the commerciality of it all. But he makes a good point, is it, having a system, being able to actually think like that in advance, so that people have to think more deeply to make the connections, because in order to put the jigsaw puzzle together, you need more than one book, is very powerful, right? And that's what I'm trying to do at the moment in terms of trying to go deeper myself. And I'm not saying that I don't go shallow. There's sometimes I fall into the trap as well with the digital world too. So I think, Ben, I think we've explored some really interesting topics there today. So what do you think? What do you think the answer is? If there is an answer, there may not be an answer to this. I know when we set up this Sweet Spot Safari, the whole idea was to try and investigate, get people thinking about, where the sweet spot could be, where the balances are. Do you think there is a place to find a sweet spot here or not?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's going to be different for different individuals. It's going to be different for teams, different for organizations, different for societies. So it will be different at different levels. But I think there's a recognition for me that less can be more. And one example of that is the trade-off between relationships and transactions. So we have, if you consider social media environments, the encouragement is to have more and more connections, more and more followers. But I would argue that actually there's a trade-off between the depth of a relationship and the volume of the transactions and people that you connect with. I think that one of the paradoxes that we have is that we've never been better connected before with each other, but at the same time, we've never felt more lonely and isolated. And so I think the understanding that actually connections and numbers on social media platforms do not necessarily represent the quality of those relationships you have with them. And you simply can't have quality relationships with 2,000 connections. It just doesn't work. So I think that for me, then underneath that is that we need workplaces and societies that recognize qualities as well as quantities. And so if you think about everything that we quantities are almost like signals, whether it's GDP, whether it's, targets within the workplace, whether it's number of connections, actually we should be better understanding and recognizing qualities, whether that's relationships, whether that's meaning, whether it's value creation, whether it's purpose, whatever it might be. And so these are some of the deeper aspects that we need alongside better targets and KPIs. So they're kind of my thoughts. I don't know if you've got anything to follow on there.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very powerful point, and particularly the one around the number of connections. If I look at my whole world, my own world rather, where I look at way of doing business and sustainable business, which we all have to do to survive. That business is done with those deep, meaningful connections. The one you've taken time to cultivate, in the right way, in an appropriate way, and in an authentic way. I know we talk about authenticity in other podcasts, but I think that's really important. And that is, again, going back to the triangle again, that is an absolute case where I think quality is way more important than quantity. So I think you make a really good point, and I think it's up for us all to understand that in our own space, because as we said, everything is contextual and everything is nuanced, and I think again, if I look at building on that, some of the digital marketing world, I think these days digital marketing can, it's been a growth industry over the last 5-10 years. That can be seen as superficial, and I just wonder sometimes whether digital marketing really is having the effect that people think it is. I mean, some people will say, Stephen Bartlett, of course, who's very successful, says that he's analysed all the data and it's had some effect. But again, I think that's how he's analysed the data and how he's used the data. And just that segues into, very briefly before we finish, into another point about data. It was quite interesting. There's another Financial Times correspondent who's a statistician as well. Tim Harford wrote the book, Making the World Add Up, trying to make the world add up. And he talks a bit about big data. If you remember big data 5 years ago, all the big companies, IBM and plenty of others, were getting involved in big data. And the whole idea was that, the more the merrier, effectively. The more data you have, the better the result. And actually, when you start speaking to statisticians and people like Tim, he can prove that actually, he hit his tipping point, and actually more data doesn't actually help you at all. It just convinces yourself, in fact, creates we talked about biases, a cognitive bias, that you think you've got a better analysis towards your hypothesis than you actually got. Actually, it's more important about choosing the right data. And the analogy there is a bit like choosing the right connections in order to get what you need in terms of getting the right and the most accurate answer. Because at the end, a lack of accuracy at the end of the day isn't going to help anybody at all. We all need, whatever the outcome or whatever the context and the situation, we all need a level of accuracy. So yeah. I think
just on one point, actually, I think it would be wrong to finish without having some sort of connection to the last couple of years of COVID, which we've gone through, and talking about context and situation. We found our lives collapsed into Zoom and into WhatsApp. And for me personally, these tools have utility value. But when we collapse our whole lives, our whole working lives into these modes of communication, for me, that they had limited possibilities. And I think what we've realized, the learning experience over the last couple of years, is that these are really useful tools for coming together to discuss quite transactional stuff, but they don't replace the deeper connection in the real world. And I think this is where collaboration comes in. This is where creativity comes in. This is where relationships are built in the real world. And I think the likes of WhatsApp and Zoom can help us be productive and do things very efficiently, but they need to be in tandem with actual real connection.
Oh, thank you for that, Ben. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's a really great point to end on in terms of this particular topic. So we'd like to say thank you very much again from John and Ben. Thank you for listening to us in 2022. We will be doing more of these in 2023, and we're going to hopefully bring some other people into the mix in terms of the discussions to make it richer as well. So thank you very much, and have a great new year, everybody.
Great stuff. All the best from me. Bye.